We turn now to some venerable studies in infant development that stand out as landmarks for highlighting the concerns that developmental psychologists have brought to the study of children. Both studies are concerned with the emerging sociality of very young children, and they both serve as cautionary tales in making obvious the difficulties that arise in trying to interpret the behavior of particularly pre-linguistic infants. Both studies give us fascinating glimpses of the emerging sociality of the infant, the strength of the bond with carers, and they both serve to suggest what is undoubtedly true, which is that infants are social from a very, very early age. Now, it's actually a truism that all life is social. Every living being is intrinsically social. That's a theme we'll be reinforcing throughout here. But here we're dealing with specifically the relationship between a child and an adult. Grave difficulties arise in such studies, and there has been problems in replicating both of these. We'll address that. The first study we want to look at is from 1985. It's by Murray and Trevarthen, and it's called The Emotional Regulation of Interactions Between 2-month-olds and Their Mothers. Now, the experimental setup used in this case long predates the era of Zoom and Skype and video phone. The goal of the setup was to have the infant and the mother in separate rooms and nonetheless interacting as if they were together in one room. So you can see on the right of the slide there's the infant sitting in his chair, looking at a two-way mirror sloped at 45 degrees. What this means is that the infant sees what's reflected in the mirror, which is the screen of a monitor positioned directly overhead, while at the same time a camera can be focused directly on the infant's face to record it. Now, what's on the monitor is captured by the camera facing the mother in an identical setup in another room. So in this way, this very complicated arrangement of mirrors and screens and cameras, what we have is something like a live stream. That is, the baby is looking at the mother and responding and interacting with the mother, and the mother is doing the same with the baby. Now, each infant was recorded in 2 sessions. In the first session, typically done in the morning, the infant would come in and would interact with the mother live, and the mothers made every effort to engage the infants, and because they had a lot of history and were very familiar with each other, this was typically quite a successful interaction. Then in the afternoon, the infant would be brought in and would be confronted with exactly the same image or projection as in the morning. That is, it was a recording of the mother taken from the first interaction. Now, in this case, what the child is confronted with is visually identical to what went on before. But of course, this is a recording, and recordings don't interact. Recordings are fixed. And so the child, if you think in terms of stimulus and response, the child is exposed to exactly the same stimulus, but that proves to be a very unhelpful way of thinking about this. The infants are not fooled for a moment. They realize that they don't get engaged in the way that they did in the first session. They're not interested in interacting with a recording of their mother. They immediately are sensitive to this lack of reciprocity in the interaction. So the basic finding is this, that the interaction was felicitous or went well in the live condition, but the infants showed signs of boredom or distress or disinterest in the recorded condition, in the tape condition. Now, this was a seminal study, and there have been many studies built upon it. Some have found similar effects and others have failed to replicate the findings. And this shouldn't really lead you to doubt that infants are very, very deeply social and sensitive to the contingencies of social interaction at a very young age. That is secure. But constructing experiments to demonstrate that is quite difficult. And a lot hinges on how we interpret infant behavior. The interpretation of behavior is a dark art. The construction of some means of measurement in order to record the difference between an engaged interaction and a distressful encounter is not simple. We need to find ways to score things, to agree on how to interpret this young baby's behavior. It's very, very difficult. So that's one. Here's a second one, which is even older. This is from 1977, Meltzoff and Moore, and it's called The Imitation of Facial and Manual Gestures by Human Neonates. And the illustration on the slide there is taken from this paper, and it demonstrates the findings very directly. In this study, the researchers were filmed making faces at the baby and doing hand things, playing with their hands. And specifically, they were looking for imitative reactions on the part of the infant. And these are very, very young. These are neonates, 2 to 3 week old. And shown here is the somewhat surprising finding that the infant seems to imitate quite a range of gestures, facial gestures of the experimenter. Now, these are very, very young. Being only 2 to 3 weeks old, they have no experience whatsoever of seeing themselves. Nobody ever told them that they have a face. Nobody ever told them that the nose on that person corresponds to my nose. These things are obvious to you. You've inhabited a body for a lot of years. For a 2 or 3 week old infant, this is not a matter of learning. This is a matter of a sort of intuitive understanding. Now, in the paper, it was claimed that there were 3 distinct facial gestures and 2 manual gestures that the infants reliably copied. One was the open mouth, one was tongue protrusion, and one was pouting. And the manual gestures were finger pointing, and I think the other one was opening the hand, I forget. A fascinating finding, and required very painstaking work doing frame-by-frame analysis of the film, actual celluloid film used to record these. Doing research in the 70s was hard. But it also brought to the fore lots of problems. That is, you have to interpret the infant's response. So faced with data collected in this manner, you might ask whether it's a chance coincidence. That is, the child is animated and the researcher does something, and sometimes there's a similarity between the animation of the child and the researcher. They could be independent of each other. The infant is very differently constructed from the experimenter. It's a 2 to 3 week old infant, very, very young. So what are the criteria by which you say that is or is not an imitation? Well, this led to many further studies, and the results have been whittled down. But there is one finding that seems to have remained relatively secure, and that's the tongue protrusion gesture, sticking out the tongue like that. Is that still imitation if we reduce this to a single finding? I'm not sure. Interestingly, it has been found that baby chimps will respond in a similar fashion to baby humans when the human experimenter sticks their tongue out. That's one gesture that seems to transfer. And they only do this when they're very, very young. They quickly develop species-specific interpretations of the faces that are given to them. But at a very young age, the similarity between a human face and a chimpanzee face seems to suffice, and the similarity between chimps and humans seems to suffice that this finding may be transferable to chimpanzees. Now, when we ask whether a behavior that we observe is an imitation or not, we enter into quite a profound discussion. Now, this question is known as the correspondence problem. And the basic question is this: when you have one sequence of movements rather than another, by what criteria do you classify that as an instance of a specific behavior? Remember, we have noted throughout that behavior brings with it the interpretation of the observer. That is, behaviors are not free existing things. Rather, they're a way that we choose to parse up and interpret the continuous stream of movement of an organism, interpret it in light of purposeful action. So the entanglement of the observer and the observed here is very obvious. And this raises a question which we always have in developmental psychology and in cognitive science generally, which is when and how and in what way can we aspire to being objective? Objectivity is not a simple thing, and the crucial involvement of the interpretive act of the experimenter cannot be removed from these findings. So one of the required readings for this section is this article by Reddy and Trevarthen, What We Learn About Babies from Engaging Their Emotions. And they respond or comment on this particular problem here. We have deliberately slanted the emphasis in our title to engaging with babies, because we want to show evidence that engagement is how we gain psychological knowledge about others, including babies, and that this is as true for the psychologist as it is for other folk. If we want to know what a baby, an adult, or an animal feels or thinks, we have to engage with them, allowing ourselves to feel the sympathetic response that the other's actions and feelings invite. This is not optional. This is how we come to respond to others, to interpret others, to understand others. And it precludes any simplistic interpretation of what an objective science of the other might be.